Let's bring in our guest for this hour, joining us to discuss, National Trial Attorney Michael Jaafar. Michael, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining me on the program. And first and foremost, I just want to say, as I anticipate the defense delivering their closing argument, I think they start off with the line, no coercion, no case. Because if there's no coercion, then it's going to be difficult for this jury to move on in this case and find him guilty of these charges.
I 1000% agree with you. I always tell young trial attorneys that whenever you have a case and you, before the trial starts, you feel that there's a weak part of your case, you lean hard onto the strong part of your case. Why do I say that? I think that the prosecution knew that the weakest side of their case is the word coercion. I've said this before the trial started. They knew that that was the weakest side of their case because of the facts that they knew that they were going to present. So they leaned hard on the other side of their case, which is the grossness, the disgustingness of his conduct and the unconventional nature of his conduct and the sheer depravity. And they did that, in my opinion, in order to have the jury give them reasonable inferences when they deliberate the case on the coercion side by thinking about the grossness side. Because what are the odds that any member of that jury could relate to any of the conduct that Sean Combs pretty much is clearly done? Not a single one of them, not even 1% of the richest people in the world, I think, can even understand this type of depravity. So the word coercion is a big, big, big hurdle. Will they overcome it? We'll see. I think their closing argument is going to be basically leaning into that. I think they made a huge mistake in this case by not using their biggest asset, which is Sean Combs on the stand, which is a trained actor who's acted in plays, who could have stood up there and just verified everything that their theory wants the jury to verify. But other than that, I think their closing arguments are their case, because their cross-examination of the witnesses was basically their presenting of the evidence in their case. I think besides the mistake that I believe, my personal feeling is that they made a mistake by not bringing them on the stand, but their closing arguments really need to bring it home. They really need to bring it home because the state, the federal government brought it in their case.
And Mike, in the prosecution's closing argument, one of the things that I like that they're doing is, it's easy to sort of overlook the coercion, right? If you're thinking that all these women wanted was the lifestyle. But what they've done in their closing that I like as I follow along is they said the lifestyle that he offered them was part of the coercion. And I like that they did that because that's one of the toughest hurdles for this jury to get over.
Yeah, they had to have done that, right? Because what other answer would they have had for why these people, why these participants participated in this stuff, you know, while also getting the largesse of being around Sean Combs, P. Diddy, a media mogul, right? Now the defense is going to come back and say, well, that's a chicken and egg scenario. It doesn't matter. You know, they didn't start doing this and then they got paid. They were part of it. They could have easily gotten some of the largesse and then said no. So they could have he could have begun giving them the largesse, the purses, the cars. You paid for rent for a woman with her kid. They could have started receiving that and then said no when they realized, oh wait, here's like the hook. Here's the fine print of this relationship. I don't like the fine print. I'm out of it. And they could have done that. So that's what the defense is going to do. But I agree with you. The federal government had to lean in on that. They had to lean hard because what else were they going to do? That was it. They clearly hate Sean Combs to bring this case and to pursue it as viciously as they have. They hate him. And so this is their way of explaining why these gifts were given. They weren't because he's a generous person. It's because he was basically grooming them for a depraved relationship.
Yeah, like we heard from Jane, you know, he was paying for her living where she lived. So that alone kept her under his thumb and made her and put her in a position where she had to do whatever he wanted. So I think those things were pretty effective. The defense doing their best to point out the positive points in this case. Still a tough road to hoe. Let's bring in our guest here. That's still with us, National Trial Attorney Michael Jaafar. And Michael, as I said, you know, it's a circumstantial case, but it's a strong circumstantial case. One of the things in the favor, I guess you could say that, although I'm going to argue, these days when you don't have a body in a case, it's not like 20 years ago. Today, it's, you know, here basically all it took was the prosecutor saying he hasn't used his phone since the time he's disappeared. He hasn't been on social media since the time he disappeared. He's a guy that liked to connect with family and friends, has not connected with family and friends in the myriad ways we can connect with family and friends these days. I think that's enough in this day and age that you don't necessarily need a body in a case like this.
I love the way you just framed it. I'm going to use this going forward when I discuss the lack of a body in cases in the future, because you crystallized it perfectly. And here's essentially how you framed it. In the modern era, you're basically dead if you don't call or text anybody. You don't go on social media. You can track from a digital trail whether or not a person is still alive by looking at their use of their phone. You said 20 years ago, yeah, absolutely. Can you imagine if this was not 2025, if it was 1925 and you don't have a body for a month or a year? It doesn't. Some people disappear for 50 years, right? I was watching a documentary about a sailor who disappeared for 4 years traversing a new trail. He wasn't presumed dead. He was just gone for 4 years on an expedition, right? So yeah, you're presumed dead. I love the way you framed it. Yes, essentially that is making it harder for the defense in 2025 in a case exactly like this as it would be, 20 years ago. Obviously, it's still kind of helpful for the defense, but not as helpful as it was 20 years ago. I do agree.
Yeah, I mean, we are essentially our electronic footprint. That's our lives is all along these things. But I will say this about not having a body. Whether it's a guilty verdict or not, and again, we'll get folks to that in just a minute, there's still no closure. It's one of those types of things where the folks who love this man, this victim in this case, with no body, a guilty verdict is kind of empty because you don't get that closure I think that you need.
Absolutely. And this is very tough on the family because here's why. What if he's still alive? What if he's not? You don't have that closure. So that is something very, very repugnant for victims' families.
Yeah, all right, Mike, stand by. I do need to step aside now for a quick break. They do go on to poll the jury there. Nothing, of course, changes. Christopher Davis, 37 years old or so, found guilty of all charges, second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and 8 different fraudulent use of personal identification of a deceased individual played a big role in this case. Let's bring in our guest still with us, National Trial Attorney Michael Jaafar. Michael, just want to mention again that he is facing life in prison as a result of these convictions. And I want to get first your reaction, then I want to talk about these charges of the fraudulent use of personal identification. But first, your reaction to the verdict.
I always look at the expression of defendants when a jury is read, when a verdict is read, and that's my way of gauging, my poor man's anecdotal way of gauging whether or not they actually did it. Because look, Michael, there are innocent people who get convicted, and there are guilty people who get acquitted and walk free. Christopher Davis is not one of those people. He's a guilty person who got convicted. I firmly believe that the jury got this one completely right. So I believe that he's justice was served on this gentleman. I have no doubt that the jury got this one right.
Yeah, I would have to agree. A lot of evidence, all circumstantial, but very strong circumstantial evidence. His actions told a very clear story. And you're exactly right. There was very little reaction from him. Initially, he looked afraid. He looked over at his attorney, he kind of looked at the camera, and he looked like he was afraid right before they read the verdict. But once it was read, I knew he knew what was going on. I want to talk about those charges there, the fraud charges using the identification of a deceased individual. We talk about this many times, Mike. There were 8 different charges. He would use it at PNC Bank, Home Depot, various places. And we talk about how prosecutors can use this type of information, these types of charges, to make sure that a jury doesn't like a defendant. Now, this is a case where I don't know if that's 100% necessary. They could have gone any direction they wanted, but they really leaned in on those charges. And part of it was, you really end up not liking the guy. If he's worried about this guy missing and he's going along using all of his cards and spending his money, that's not a good look.
No, not a good look at all. Not a good look, not even 1% good look. This is exactly why they use it, and this is why they piled on. At the end of the day, they also did that, in my opinion, to counteract the fact that he cooperated with police officers, right? Because anytime, look, as defense attorneys, we tell all of our clients never cooperate with police officers. But I would be lying if I didn't tell you that I like it when clients cooperate with police officers and don't hurt their case, and I'm hired after the fact. Because then I can sit down and say, well, look, he cooperated with you. I know I'm right on this because his defense attorney said multiple times in the trial he cooperated with police officers, and they used that as a rallying cry that, hey, he's innocent, and one of the reasons he's innocent is because he cooperated. So I think that's why the state used all these false charges, these fraudulent charges, and use of the card to counteract that piece of it, because they wanted the jury to look at this person as a villain, and they did a good job, and they did what they needed to do.
Yeah, they absolutely did what they needed to do. And the other thing about this case that I thought worked really well for prosecutors was the motive. And again, we know prosecutors don't need motive, but boy, if you have it, it's just a great thing to have. And here, and they're so lucky to have this. Right before this happened, he calls and texts a friend and says, look, I got to get rid of this idiot. And so you know he's getting ready to kick the guy out of the apartment. And then you have neighbors who hear something going on in the apartment, the victim screaming, no, 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 and then whimpering. I mean, that type of evidence you don't often come across in these circumstantial cases. And that's what made this one so strong, Mike.
Yeah, he used his credit card to buy the tools that he used presumably to kill him and cover the body. So yeah, so he did himself in. Digital forensic trail, Michael, it's a new era as of 7 years ago. These trials are all based on your Apple Watch, your health watch, your forensic data. In other trials, we saw the battery temperature. It's a completely different era.
Yeah, small measure of justice for the Smilback family and friends of this man. And you know, again, no body in this case means not complete closure, but hopefully this is some sense of justice for the family and friends of Mr. Smilback. All right, Michael Jaafar, I want to thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. Truly appreciate it, my friend. We'll see you again real soon.